conversation of the day, which is going to be a live conversation with Tanya Turton, moderated by Fiona Raye Clarke. So this event is presented by Diaspora Dialogues, and they support emerging Canadian writers to turn their craft into a career through mentorship, professional development, and opportunities to publish and present their work. We invest in the development of both artist and audience and on working towards refining the mainstream, ensuring that it is as diverse as Canada itself. And just before we begin and I introduce both of our speakers, I'd like to start by doing a land acknowledgement that we operate on land that is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We are privileged to live, work, and create in this territory and strive to act with awareness and solidarity. And without further ado, I'm very excited to announce today's conversation, which is going to be with Tanya Turton on her brand new book and moderated by Fiona Raye Clarke. So please give it up for these two fabulous people who are going to take over now.
Thank you everyone for coming. So I'd like to start off by introducing our featured author. Hailing from Kingston, Jamaica, and raised in Toronto, Tanya Turton is an award-winning entrepreneur, storyteller, wellness educator, and mental health advocate. Using storytelling, safe space, and education, Tanya has created safer spaces for Black women, LGBTQ members, and youth to feel heard, seen, and witnessed. Over the years, she has launched two initiatives, Adornment Stories, a grassroots nonprofit for Black women and femmes navigating mental health challenges by using beauty and digital storytelling to transform their experiences, and Niyam Samar, Redefining Beauty, an educational platform where Tanya shares a wealth of knowledge in fields of self and collective care and intersecting wellness. Her writing can be found in Shameless Magazine, providing safe space and guiding tools for self-love. Her work centers on early engagement, mental health initiatives, and intersectional frameworks of engagement. And of course, today we'll be discussing her debut novel, Jade Is a Twisted Green.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll invite Tanya right now to give a little reading of an excerpt of her book.
Okay, so we're gonna start with the chapter, Southern Hospitality. The next morning, the sun glimmered through the curtains, and Tay's eyes flickered open as she smelled fresh waffles, shrimp, and fruit in the kitchen. The steam of the shower drifted into the bedroom and warmed the air. She rolled over and lay in the middle of the bed, held her eyes closed, and took a mental picture of the moment. The feeling of joy tingled from her toes to her scalp, and she let it radiate through her body. She had manifested this moment. She had meditated and seen herself in a plush bed, the sun shining on her face and breathing warm air filled with love. Pride was the root of her joy. It had taken 15 years, but she was finally starting to feel settled. It was ironic, but 24 hours in Atlanta was making Toronto really feel like home. She lay there thinking about Auntie Ma and how grateful she was to have her. Leaving home had been hard. Tay remembered being 11 and arriving on a snowy day. She thought her auntie would stay much longer than she had, and that was her last trip to Toronto. At first, she had been consumed with a longing for the smell of fresh breadfruit, the way her aunt would roast it outside on the wood fire as the rooster crowed. But the more she felt at home in Toronto, the more estranged from home she was. There was no way to accept and lean into her life in Canada without accepting and releasing her life in Jamaica. The push and pull of grounding and longing danced inside of her most days, one igniting or smothering the other at any given moment. The sun was shining today. The trees in Georgia were magnificent. She was not home, nor was she supposed to feel like it. but this mundane fact of her being an intentional visitor brought her the solace she needed to lie a few extra minutes, eyes closed, air warm, letting the sun make love to her melanin.
Beautiful line to end on. Thank you. So for folks who might not know, could you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, Jade Is a Twisted Green is a coming-of-age story, particularly centering the intersections of Jade, who is a Black queer woman coming of age in Toronto. She's 25 and has lost her sister, and that the grief of that has been really overwhelming. And in that overwhelm, she's kind of let go of a few years of her life, you know? And we enter the story in the moment where she's starting to reclaim her life and starting to become aware in the ways that the grief has impacted her over time, and is taking intentional steps to, you know, really figure out who she wants to be in this world of Toronto. As well as we see the folks who are closest to her, we get to experience the story from their point of view and the differing ways that grief has impacted their life. And we see this, you know, intersection of sorts where we're seeing Jade, but we're also seeing, you know, her best friend and her ex-girlfriend and her ex-boyfriend and the folks who are close to her, and what is happening in their life as well as hers, and how that all comes together to really bring some moments of freedom and release for her.
Thank you. Beautiful description. So yeah, that was one of the things that really struck me, that multiplicity of voices. Could you tell us a little bit why that was so important and crucial to the story?
Yeah, I really wanted to tell the story of coming of age in Toronto, particularly from a Jamaican perspective. And I realized that I couldn't do that with just one character, right? Like, there are so many ways that we come to be in this city, and speaking to just Jade's experience, while Jade's experience is really important, it's impacted by those around her and their various experiences. And so each of the identities of the folks, we get to see different point of views in the story. And each of those identities are with intention. One, because of how it impacts Jade and how she comes to be, but two, because I'm hoping that as folks read this story, it's an opportunity to, you know, have a look into the life of. And I think there are sometimes it can be assumed that there's one way, right? To be Jamaican in the city of Toronto, that there's one way to do that, but there isn't. And through seeing the different characters and different experiences, for example, I'm trying not to give any spoilers, but for example, we see that Morgan, who is, you know, a first generation Jamaican Canadian, has a very different experience versus Tay, who came here as a small child on a winter day, and their ways of coming to be and how they relate to the land and how they relate to their identity is very different because of these different roots of how they came to be in here. So it feels really important to in an opportunity to tell a coming-of-age story, to tell one that gives space and allows for multiple stories to exist together.
Lovely. And you speak of Toronto, even from the excerpt you read, it's that kind of arrival and estrangement and isolation. So why was it important to tell a very Toronto story? Mm-hmm. And secondly, why was it also important for the characters to leave? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna be honest with you. I feel like it was important to tell a story because I needed it. Yes. I personally am a person who, I was born in Jamaica, as my bio mentioned, and I spent you know, a good portion of my life here trying to figure out my place in this city, trying to figure out a sense of belonging, and particularly as a person who's sitting at the intersection of Blackness and queerness and womanhood, and trying to figure out, like, where do I fit in the city of Toronto? What is the space for me? And I've been grateful that in my 20s, I started to really find that and started to really figure out where I fit. But in some of my early years, I genuinely did not know. And so I feel like the story is important because I'm hoping that, you know, that it gives more space and it allows for someone else who reads the story to see that we exist and that we fit here and that there is a sense of, like, we do belong here, you know? Because I remember being a young girl, quite frankly, and looking for books that would reflect some of the intersections I have, and I felt like it was something I was challenged by, you know, and I started to create stories in my mind that essentially, if I could not find the representation, that we did not exist or that I did not belong here. And so I think it's important to write ourselves into history. I think it's important to, showcase that we are here, we've been here, we belong here, and there is space for us. But also to give various, and going back to what I said, like various perspectives of what that belonging here could look like. And each character, while the book centers Jade, it's important to note that each character is so different, right? Like Amethyst and Jade and Rose and Tay are very different in terms of how they're navigating the intersection of, Jamaican identity and Black womanhood and coming of age in Toronto. And so I did that with intention for us to know that even though we have these different ways of being, we all belong in this space. And so the reason why is it important? It's important because I think that through our writings, through whether it be novels and fiction, but other kinds of writing as well, we write ourselves into history to remind others that we've been here, we belong here.
Yes, so true. And picking up on your words of intentionality, like how did you kind of come up with this grief story? To me, it was very cathartic to read it, especially in this time, over the last couple of years, all that we've, felt, suffered, dealt with, especially as Black folks. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think that some aspects of it is personal. So what I have navigated myself, and you said the word catharsis, and I feel like that's a very accurate description of the experience of writing for me. I think that writing is a catharsis. I write as a way to process, to make sense of the world that I live in, as well as, I've been asked this question during this journey, like, is this book representing any particular people? And, I think the gift of fiction is that we get to make things up. And so in making things up, we actually get to, pull from the world around us and observe certain things, certain truths as we see them, as well as be creative in writing what we wished was or how we hoped things could be. And so I feel like for me in doing so, I'm able to present the world with some aspects of what, as I said, like I know to be true, as well as what I'm hoping will become true in time.
Yeah, I definitely feel that in the intention of the journey, because there's so much time that we get to spend with these characters in their finding self-care, finding how to name themselves, define themselves, and struggle against what they define as freedom. And so, it was so beautifully told. One question I had, and it kind of relates to the title. In the book, Jade mentions, I always felt twisted, alone in my experience. Feeling invisible always made me the most twisted. Could you talk a bit about the concept of twistedness?
Yeah, twisted. I think the twisted for me as a concept, as a construct itself, is the feeling of what quite literally, like the winding feeling of being, over there and here all at the same time. Twisted because the journey itself is not just, a straight road that we walk down. That road winds and twirls in different ways. So twisted in that way, but also quite frankly, if you're a lover of pop culture, Grey's Anatomy has this conversation between Meredith and Christina. Shonda Rhimes is amazing. And they talk about this idea of twisted sisters. And I remember watching that and thinking there's something here, this idea of presenting womanhood outside of what has been prescribed to us and how we think that we're allowed to be. And so twisted also, for me, I was inspired by that conversation of this idea of two twisted sisters. And when I think about Rose and Jade, I think that they're twisted sisters. I think they're both actually twisted and they don't think the other is, which is so interesting as twin sisters, that when you read the book, you see that they adore their twin. They think their twin has life figured out. And then the twin themselves is like, no, I don't. But they don't talk much about that with each other. And so twisted in the quite literal version of it, but also twisted in the ways that we are twisting constructs of womanhood and identity and who we think we have to be.
Incredible. There are a lot of stone references, natural references. There's a lot of landscape, like the sea. hiking, climbing hills. Like, what inspired that? Like, why was that important to show Black folks, particularly in these environments? Engaging with these elements.
Wow, you're the first person who's asked me this question. I'm appreciative, actually, because as you ask, I'm like, oh, let me think about that. I guess that's, as you say it, I'm like, that is true. I haven't reflected on that piece. I think, honestly, because I'm personally a lover of nature, the reference to green in the book references so many different things, everything from Jamaican identity to the heart chakra, but also green from life, like life from the earth, life from plant life. Like, I think that's really important. And so for me as a lover of nature, but also because I think that the landscape, the land itself tells so many stories. And so you mentioned this reference to the land, and I often reference the land as a way to embody the story of that land. So I talk about being in Jamaica. I really wanted to describe the earth itself, the red dirt of St. Elizabeth is important to actually talking about that experience, the hills of a countryside, as well as talking about the land in Montreal, the land in Toronto, because I do think land holds stories as well, and it's important that in our storytelling we're in relationship and also acknowledging the land as we're talking about the characters who are moving through the story.
Beautiful, thank you. Yes, I'm so glad I asked. I'm curious when you say that, like, there were a lot of like pop references, like there was some awesome like nostalgia because it's set in a particular time in the past, right? It's not necessarily current. What kind of drove that decision for you?
Because I love the nostalgia of the 2000s, and I think that telling this story, it was important to place it in a particular time. The actual story itself, while we follow Jade from May 2014 to November of 2014. And so it's actually a short period of time in her life that she's having these really large revelations of self. But because grief itself is not not just grief, but like I think the idea of coming to be and understanding our pieces and putting them together is not, as we mentioned, this idea of being twisted is not a direct path. It's a lot of going backwards as well as going forward. We see flashbacks happen quite a bit in the novel, and those flashbacks take us back to early 2000s, 2008. And for me, growing up in Toronto during that time, for folks who, were also coming of age in that time, it was such a particular moment. I think it was particular for a lot of reasons because of what was happening in, music and culture at the time, but also because it was a time before. I do think that, in the digital era, so much has changed, so much has shifted, and I do personally have a nostalgia for that moment before and some of the ways that we would navigate the world and some of the things that, still felt a little, and it's that the story happens in that moment between, because there is that moment where Jade jumps on Instagram to see if she can find this person, so it's still speaking to some of what is now, but also that moment that is before and the ways that we used to or ways that we could engage with each other in that time. So it felt important to offer the nostalgia and to, in some ways, write back to what was and to give that space and to honor that time.
I totally agree, and I really loved that about the book. There's a lot of patois, like people speak to each other as each other, which I really loved and appreciated. Could you talk a little bit about, your desire for that, any reactions to that?
That felt really important to me, like patois, because that's part of my own experience of coming of age here. And I mentioned it very slightly in the book. It's just a moment where one character is a little taken aback that another character who's not Jamaican is speaking patois, because patois has become such an ingrained part of Toronto language, and sometimes in a way that I don't think people are able to acknowledge, like this is patois, that it's just like, oh, I'm speaking Toronto slang, and it's like, Toronto slang, yes, but where's the history? And to me, it's important to honor where things come from. So I also feel like I can't tell a coming of age story with all primarily Jamaican characters without giving them space to speak authentically, you know. And even in some of the characters, they move in and out of how they speak, and I describe it as connected to their emotions, you know. And so even how they speak to each other when they decide to speak patois to each other versus when they decide not to is connected to where they're at in that moment of time versus how they speak with their elders and how that shifts how they speak and how they move through space. Because I do think that for myself as well as other folks I know, that that's kind of how it is for us. We're like, depending on where I'm at, you might hear me speak incredibly differently. And it felt important to me to also write in patois because there is like grammar and rules to speaking patois that I don't think always get acknowledged in the way. What makes it hard, I think, for some of us who, you know, have spoken patois all of our life is when folks are using it in Toronto slang, is it falls sometimes outside of the understanding of like grammar rules, so on and so forth, and in a way that doesn't really give it its respect, I think. And so I really wanted to work hard in my writing to like, is this how we would actually say it? So much so that I was literally on the phone with my cousin, like my cousin who lives in Jamaica, reading it out loud, like, is this how I would say this? Or do you think that we can, because it's this blend of bringing in folks from back home and, you know, ensuring that it fits to like what was said, but also making it current to Toronto, because I do think there are ways that we have transformed the language just in the nature of being a part of the diaspora and you know, this particular body of land. So it felt important to me to write it as authentically as possible and to incorporate it as a way to allow the story to be as authentic as possible, because this is what I know to be in terms of how I move spaces with my friends and with the folks that I love.
I love that. I love that work. One thing I found really healing about the book was the reaction of the elders to folks' sexuality and their identification, on how like simple and beautiful it was. Could you talk a little bit about that? It wasn't like big, huge blowing up. So, you know, there's even a line about I didn't come out. Like it wasn't a coming out. You know, it was like a coming in.
Yeah, that was important to me to particularly because I think that a lot of what I guess I would say popular culture, like the dominant discourse right now about Jamaican identity and queer identity is that these are two separate identities and that they can't coexist together. And so it felt important to me to make space for that and to acknowledge that. In some ways, I think that I am, truthfully speaking, writing things as I hope them to be, as I wish they were. And so for me, a coming in story feels more authentic than a coming out story, you know? And also writing them as I know it to be, because, you know, as I mentioned, like as a queer Black woman myself, you know, a joy that I have, I'm married to a woman, and my mother, actually just like yesterday, my mother and my wife and I went out to lunch, and I don't think we get enough stories about that is happening, and that we are living and existing in beautiful ways, and we have found ways to, you know, bring together culture as well as living authentic and full identities, and that folks have the capacity to grow and to love and to, you know, have hard conversations, and in those hard conversations be transformed in their relationships, their families, and the communities. And I don't think we see enough of that. And so it felt important to position that in the story as a reminder that that is happening. And so some of it, as I mentioned, is a writing as I hope things to be, and also a reminder that this is happening for some. And so let's create a more holistic and well-rounded story when we talk about queer Jamaican identity.
Lovely, lovely. Could you talk a little bit about the different, like, mental health? Because I know that's part of your work in, like, you know, outside of writing. Why was it important to show all these different ways that like grief and also just being a part of this land, being in these bodies, how that affects us, how it affects us differently and divergently? Because, for example, the two sisters, they struggle, you know, really against and for freedom, their own versions of it, but take very different routes.
Yeah. I love your interpretation. I just want to say that. I love it. I'm like, it's so nice hearing you talk about my book. Thank you. I think that in this idea of like freedom, I think that that's one of the words that you said that feels really important to me. That when we're thinking about mental health and we're thinking about freedom, I, as you mentioned, a lot of my work centers this idea of freedom and like liberation and care and what that could look like for us. And I think that these things all go hand in hand. And going back to what I mentioned earlier, for me, it is about giving us potential realities. Something that I mention as a way to describe my work is that I do world building. When we think of world building, we often think of science fiction. Like we often think about world building being, like way over there. But I also think world building is dreaming up the world we want to live in and how we hope the world could provide care for us, grace for us, so on and so forth, and writing that into our stories. And that is also world building to me. And so the reason why I incorporate space for talking about mental health, the reason why there's a large theme around freedom is because that to me is world building and giving us opportunity to meditate in some ways, to meditate on the idea of this. And I hope that through seeing different characters and their different point of views, that someone who needs it, someone who may not have seen their particular kind of or their particular experiences of mental health reflected back to them, that they could see it. And hopefully my intention is to write it with grace in a way that they feel cared for and held in it, because in the dominant discourse of mental health conversation, I don't think that it's often, or something I have struggled with is not seeing enough grace and care in how it's talked about and written about, particularly for folks who are of, various intersections, being able to have space for all those intersections being held in how we're talking about mental health. And if we're gonna talk about mental health, I also think it's important to talk about this idea of like care and freedom and liberation and what that could look like, and use, narrative as a space to dream that up.
Yes. I love thinking of your book as speculative fiction.
Oh, I love that. Yes.
It's juicy and delicious. But speaking of which, your book is very sensual and sensuous. I love the expansive notions of love, actually, and consent, which are beautiful. Like I thought that, with one of the characters, for example, it becomes clearer why there are certain blocks or certain hesitations within the relationship, because that story is revealed. Could you talk a little bit about that? Like, it's something I haven't read much at all, actually, especially from like a Black queer femme perspective.
Yeah, I think that this idea of like sensual and consent, for me, those things, like it's important for them to come together hand in hand. And it's important the reason why there are multiple point of views in the book is because I personally felt like it was important to understand where each character was coming from. Like it was important to understand, because I think that when we read, we attach our own stories, as we do in life. When we meet someone, we attach our own stories to who they are, how they are, and why they're that way. And my hope is that through having multiple point of views, as you mentioned, we're seeing why certain characters are making particular decisions and why they're engaging with the experience in a very particular way, but also why sometimes there's friction, why sometimes in their effort to hold each other with grace, in their desire to desire each other and to be sensual with each other, that there is also friction in that, because they're coming from this experience from very different perspectives and different histories. And when I think about the consent piece, it's about how do we honor that? Like, how do we honor that we both have very different, backstories, very different reasons of how we got to this moment, but we're still in the moment together. We're still right here together in this moment. So I think the consent is about being willing to have those hard conversations, but also not always knowing how, because we see Jade, particularly from the beginning of the book, go through that journey of not always knowing how to have the hard conversation. And we see her actively, particularly in the relationship with Tay, work so hard to figure out how to put the words together. And it isn't until, one of the final chapters that she's able to really concisely explain where she is, but if we pay attention, she's been in that conversation since the very first conversation they had, trying to get the words out, because I think sometimes consent looks like that we're in conversation with each other. It doesn't always happen all at once in one moment. It takes time to build the trust, the intimacy, and the, availability to have that conversation.
Oh, that's so profound.
Thank you.
Hope folks are taking notes. So one of the journeys that Jade goes through is kind of finding voice, both for like her expression of herself, for her career, for her livelihood, for her love languages and love styles, but also very tangibly as a writer. Could you talk a little bit about your journey as a writer, how you gave yourself this permission?
I'm still on the journey, honestly speaking. It took me a long time to feel a sense of permission to call myself a writer. I've been, quite frankly, writing my whole life in some way or another, because as I mentioned, writing has been a tool for me to process my experiences, and it has given me the catharsis that you spoke about. And yet still, I think that there's this industry aspect of writing that I had a hard time with, in terms of like, well, can I call myself a writer if my writing doesn't look like this particular thing or isn't embodied in this very particular way? Again, which has been a challenge for me. I think that it started to get easier when I allowed myself to play. Like, I feel like I'm in relationship with the words, and I'm allowing myself to play in the story. And I actually took a writing class that was tremendously helpful for writing my novel. And in the class, what I did, we would have these workshops, and we'd be able to bring our work to class, and everyone would get feedback, but also we'd have these prompts. And it's in doing those things that it took away some of the fear in the writing process, and allowed me to genuinely be immersed in joy. And I think one of the most transformative experiences for me with my writing is that I genuinely feel joy as I do it. And I feel like I get to enter this zone of, playfulness and excitement, but also meditation and mindfulness. All of that is happening for me in the writing process. And doing that has been transformative enough that I feel like I'm able to bring more fullness to my writing, and particularly this novel. I first wrote just a bit of it way back, like 10 years ago. And as my 22-year-old self. And my 22-year-old self, I think that I wrote from a place of expectations and what I thought I was supposed to deliver, and allowing myself to engage with writing as a form of play has allowed me to actually be present to the moment, and not so much thinking about what everyone else is going to perceive from the writing, but actually allowing to pour out of me the energy, what I actually feel, what feels authentic in that moment. And being present to my writing has been transformative. So joy plus presence is a good time.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful responses, like truly. Because I was going to ask, how long did it take you to develop this idea, because even in the tougher moments, did you have to do something to release that energy?
Yeah, I think the question, length of time of writing, is always an interesting question, because there is no direct answer. I watched a masterclass recently with Shonda Rhimes talking about writing a script, and she's like, people ask me how long I wrote it. I'm like, a year and a day, but really I took a year of thinking and a day of writing. And so my answer to that question is that I first got the idea for wanting to write a coming-of-age story, particularly about Jade. At the time, I just called the book Jade. And I knew the pieces around Jade and Rose's relationship were really important. And so it did center that. And I also knew that she would be an artist. And so I wanted that. But the decade between the actual initial concept and thought and the writing process was a time for me to come of age, a time for me to notice my surroundings and take note of the truths, per se, that I was seeing in my environment. And so I feel like that 10 years was a 10 years process of research, living the research, And then the opportunity presented itself to write, because I think life is serendipitous in that way. We're like, I have an idea, but like, maybe it won't be anything. And then, an opportunity presents itself, like this could be a thing. And when I found out it was a thing, I was like, oh, I guess I better write now. So 6 months was a time period that I had to really dive into it. And speaking to what you said about some of the hard moments, the chapter about Rose, like it's literally titled Rose, was a really hard chapter to write for me. And I remember arriving to that chapter late at night, and I was like, oh, I can't write this at night. Like, it's actually too heavy to be in this right now. I need to create as much lighthearted energy around me to be able to go to the depths and the I really do think like the belly of grief is what it takes to write that chapter. And to go there, I had to do all of the care things in my living environment to allow myself to feel safe enough to write from that place.
That brings to mind the thought about dreams and dreaming, kind of like how we were talking about this book as a speculative fiction work potentially, right? There are some powerful dreams that happen throughout the piece, and there's like ways of communicating with the other side and a little bit. Could you talk about that, this concept of dreaming, both as like a message delivery, a release,
Yeah, I think that also speaks to Jamaican culture specifically, because as a Jamaican, I grew up with this relationship with dreaming. Like you in your families, you would have a dream and you would tell your family the dream and they would tell you the meaning of the dream. And that for me was a very normalized experience. And so it felt important to immerse that into the book as a normalized experience for these characters, because I didn't really think anything of it, I think, until I started being a part of other cultures and other folks talking about that not necessarily being, for some cultures it is, for some cultures it isn't. And I think that in writing a book that centers an identity that not just from like social location, but identity of a culture and a legacy of people, it's important to incorporate some of the tools of wellness, some of the tools of connection, some of the tools of spirituality and healing that has been historically present for us as a culture.
And Rose becomes an ancestor, so there's this conversation and thought about ancestors being potentially, our age or even younger. And I had an experience of that recently this summer, unfortunately. So could you talk a little bit about some of the ancestors, you think of when you're writing or when you were writing this book?
It's interesting, the concept of ancestors, right? Because when I wrote that Rose was an ancestor, one of the conversations we had in the editing room is folks were like, well, is she an ancestor because she doesn't have children, so she's not technically an ancestor? And I'm like, oh, this is also cultural, I think. Like, I had not conceived of that until the editing process, and having someone question whether Rose is an ancestor had me realize that for us, ancestry is not about like biological lineage. It's actually a spiritual experience. It's about how that person has contributed to the lives of everyone around them and has therefore forever impacted those lives. And that is not whether they biologically birth children or not. It's really about their legacy of their impact. And so my sister is an ancestor that I think is the impetus of this book. As I my sister passed away many years ago. I was 11 at the time, and I was home at the time of her passing. And I think that I know that impacted me forever. And in writing, I believe that there was a catharsis of that experience for me, but also processing what that has been like for me throughout my own coming of age story. So when I dedicate the book to my sister, because I think my sister is the ancestor who is the impetus, who is the spirit behind this book, and why it felt so important for me to tell this story.
Gorgeous. And who are some of your literary ancestors?
I was actually just having this conversation recently about my wife and I went to Berlin, and we were like, we have to go to Lake Krummelanke because Audre Lorde used to go to this lake all the time and like hang out there. And I was like, I just have to be in the water. I just need to know that Audre Lorde and I were in this body of land in the same water, not at the same time, but like, still, same body of water has held Audre Lorde and myself. So for me, that's someone who I think about who's really paved the way for the kind of work that I'm invested in writing and the work that I do.
And what works in particular are you thinking of there?
You're really putting me on the spot.
No,
I think that particularly when you talked about my book really explores sensuality, I feel like the idea that I got to write a book about, Black queer women loving and centering consent is because Audre Lorde has written about the erotica, because of Sister Outsider, and the ways in which that has paved the way for it to be possible. It's not lost on me that it's easier for me now because of the folks who have come before me.
Thank you, yes. Before we wrap, does anyone have any questions in the audience they'd love to ask? There'll also be time afterward to...
Yeah, I'll be around.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, I think that for me, what we have been told ancestry is often from this place of biological lineage. And so we think that someone is our ancestor if they have quite literally and physically come before us. And the ways that I look at ancestry, and I think not just myself, but I definitely feel like it's a cultural experience, and how I have been inducted into this understanding of ancestry, that we have ancestors who, like me mentioning Audre Lorde is not my biological ancestor, but in the ways in which she has done the work that she's done in the spaces that she's opened up, she's an ancestor to me, and when it comes to thought, thinking, writing, but also just Black womanhood and that entire existence. So I think ancestry is spiritual. I think ancestry is cultural. I think ancestry is a way that we honor the folks who have been here before us, and in their energy, in their life, in the things that they have done, have made it possible for us to exist. And so they may not have made it possible for us to exist biologically or physically, but they made it possible for us to exist in all the other, ways that we show up here, whether that be energetically, whether it be our identities, whether it be the work that we do. And now that they're no longer here, acknowledging them as ancestors is a way that we still honor them, a way that we still acknowledge their contributions and the ways that they have showed up, making it possible for us to show up. Pardon? Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you for that one. Well, I'd like to ask finally, is there any advice for emerging writers out there that you would give coming on this other side of your journey?
Yeah, I feel like it's a little cliche, but I'm going to say it anyways. I genuinely think that we must write for ourselves. Like, we must write because we believe in what we're writing. We must write because it is authentic to our own, our own self, our own being. I recently heard someone mention that a lot of the writing process is actually because we want to offer it to others. And I think that there is something about being witnessed. And I think it's important we acknowledge the distinction between those things, because the desire to be witnessed in this call and response in this very human way is natural. As writers or as creatives, it's natural to want our work to be witnessed. But I think it's important that when we're actually in the process of creating, that we're present to ourselves and we're present to the actual body of work and the creative process, and not being too focused or caught up on the witnessing that will happen after, because I think when we're caught up on that, we create stories about what we want people to witness, what we think will happen, and then it takes us away from the actual moment of being in relationship to our creativity. So my hope is, my advice is, what I would tell my younger self is allow yourself to just be with the creative process and enjoy it, because also it's it can be fleeting. You work on a body of work for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and then that body of work is complete, and you birth it and you put it into the world, and then it's done. Like, your time with that process is over, and And my hope for myself, my hope for others is that we allow ourselves to make that time with that process sacred, so we don't miss the moment. Because it's so easy sometimes in life to simply just miss that moment and then spend time longing for it, being like, I wish I could go back and like rewrite this or do this differently. And I think being able to be in the moment allows us to end with that sense of catharsis and being at peace with what we created.
Thank you so much. And on that beautiful note, I'd like to thank Tanya again for joining me in this lovely conversation. Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you to Diaspora Dialogues for hosting and for Word on the Street. Again, Jade Is a Twisted Green is available. I think it might not be available for sale right now, but okay. Perfect.
Wonderful. Available for sale right now. And I will sign it. If you purchase right now, I will sign your book.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thanks for having me, Fiona. Thanks for being such a wonderful interviewer. It was great.
I sit deeply with the work. Oh, thank you. High praise. Well, that's what I'm saying. High praise. That's what I said. High praise.